In this part of the presentation, what we're looking at is the focus is on the different types of organizations that partake to information, partake to data. Well, there is no one size fits all. Why are we saying this? Because each entity at different levels of governance, at different levels of implementation and operation, each entity lives in its own bubble, in its own operational bubble. However, there are different areas where different entities come together. And in terms of data and statistics and information and the knowledge gained from that, there are key elements which are still unique for all. So they're common. So basically, how do we look at this? As I mentioned in the previous section, there are top-down and bottom-up approaches to this. And even in entities, you can work in a very small entity in development. You can work in an international entity. From our experience in Kosovo years back in 1999, that really brought to the fore when Dr. Jennifer Mazapache and myself went to Kosovo to do some aid work, and really brought to the fore how each individual entity, each individual NGO that was working on the ground and the United Nations were working together in diverse ways. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because each had their own agenda, each had their own targets, each had their own methodologies of operation. But once a week, everyone would come in together to discuss the type of data which they could actually use to share, one, and to bring up proposals for change. Okay, even though the methodologies used within that was totally different. In the case of the Maltese team, we were asked to, and we had an Albanian bodyguard and also locals working with us. The main issue was to actually spatialize the data, which means the where component for us, where, was very important. And this is one of the elements which we contributed to the Kosovo effort. So basically, when we're looking at this, some entities work at national level, okay? In the next slide, we'll actually review this. So there you have governments, you have super nations, you have larger entities, like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, and all the similar entities, United Nations Development Program, and all the rest. So what do you have here? Basically, you have to look at the importance of these giant entities, but also the importance of data as gathered from the grassroots level. Okay, this is more important than sometimes the higher up entities who need the on-the-ground, again, boots on the ground information. So basically, organizations include NGOs, non-governmental organizations, those specific NGOs whose primary focus is development work, what we're calling here is development NGOs. As I mentioned, the international organizations, trusts and foundations, but even more important are think tanks, and which bring in these groups of wise people, wise persons who can help us. I hope they're all wise. They can help us to think on different levels of thought. So, and in Italian, there's a word, saggi, the wise persons. Okay, the elders. In Arabic and Maltese, it's called sheikh. And the person with the experience of how these things work. Obviously, there's the private sector. And what's really important about these, especially the private sector, is that though governmental entities and NGOs already have social responsibility because some of their aim is there, the private sector has what we call now, or should have, embedded CSR. the corporate social responsibility aspect, where rather than just a one-way process of material take-up, but there's also another way to ameliorate the social situation around them for well-being. Okay. So where do all these fit in such a scenario, especially when you're going to source data? As we can see from the next slide, there are three types of splits. So you have government, you have private, and you have NGOs. So in government, such is governed by the three powers of state: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, each balancing out each other to ensure well-being and security and safety. You have the public sector and the public service, okay, where you have entities that are totally contained or operated by government. And you have the service also, so there you have sector and service, where they are, especially in smaller states, you also have what we call parastatals. So they're part government and part private, so they make their own income. And they have major impact in policy making. Then you have the private sector, which covers the environmental, commercial, industrial, and from what we've been discussing till now, the NGOs. So important for development. Okay? You could have a government that has failed to deliver, okay? And then you have the alternate states where the malavita or non-state entities taking up the role of the state and providing education, welfare, health, when the state should be setting that up, and then you get this this confusion of structures and abdication of some states, which makes life for NGOs and development NGOs more difficult. And then you have what NGOs operate at these levels, as we're speaking here. You have the regional, the national. Beyond that, at a more basic level, you have the local or sub-local, regional, national, and then you have the supranational. So it's a conglomerate, a collection of states working together, such as the EU or the Federated States. Even Germany is a federated state of 16 landers. So when they come at that level, NGOs need to think on how to actually deal with all the different levels. And then you have the international component, which is even more complex, but it gives access to so many different opportunities for change.